All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a hard look at the true purpose of failure. We constantly look at the giants of our modern world and just kind of assume their path to the top was this straight, uninterrupted line, right? Well, today, we're going to totally deconstruct that myth and look at the messy, sometimes really dark reality of what it actually takes to build an empire. And we're starting with a pretty chilling reality check from 1985.
Picture this. You're exactly 30 years old, and you've just been fired from the company you built with your own two hands, and you're walking away with absolutely zero severance. No safety net, no golden parachute, just a harsh, abrupt, and incredibly public exit from Apple, a massive enterprise that literally had your fingerprints on every single product it made. That was Steve Jobs.
This wasn't just a simple job loss. It was a total, incredibly public collapse of his identity. I mean, think about it. What actually happens when you lose your entire identity? For Jobs, everything he had built his whole life around was just suddenly gone. It's a terrifying concept, for sure. But as we'll see, it's also the exact crucible where true greatness is forged.
Act 1, the fall. Because before we could even talk about global empires, we really have to talk about hitting absolute rock bottom.
Jobs' descent was just dizzying. He co-founded Apple in a garage, and by his late 20s, he was already worth over $100 million. He was running one of the most talked-about companies on the planet. But then, after a really fierce power struggle, he was exiled. And the craziest part? He was pushed out by the very board and the exact CEO that he had personally brought in. It was an astonishing fall from grace.
Now, while Jobs was experiencing this sudden emotional poverty on a massive global stage, another young man, Howard Schultz, was facing severe financial poverty in a Brooklyn housing project. He had to watch his father, a really hard-working truck driver, get injured on the job and lose absolutely everything. His income, his insurance, his dignity, just silence at the dinner table. There was no severance, no safety net at all.
And this brings us to a harsh, but honestly super powerful truth. Losing everything is sometimes the only way to find out what you're actually made of. Howard Schultz swore right then and there that if he ever built a company of his own, he would never, ever treat people the way his father was treated. The seeds of these future world-changing companies, they were planted deep in the soil of their darkest, most vulnerable moments.
Moving into Act 2, the wilderness. This is that grueling, unglamorous phase that most people just skip over, but it's where the actual work gets done.
You see, neither of these comebacks happened overnight. Jobs spent a solid decade building Next and bleeding millions of his own dollars into a little company called Pixar. Meanwhile, in the 80s, Schultz fell in love with Italian espresso culture, pitched the idea to the original founders of this small bean retailer called Starbucks, and was flatly rejected. No way. So he had to leave, start his own chain, and meticulously scrape together the funding to eventually buy Starbucks right out from under them in the early 90s. And by 1996, Apple was buying Next. It's a really brutal reality check. The highlight reels always skip the invisible years. For nearly a decade, the whole world viewed Steve Jobs not as a genius visionary, but honestly, as a cautionary tale. Nobody would have blamed either of these guys if they had just thrown in the towel and lived quiet lives. But they didn't.
Which brings us to Act 3, the return. Let's look at how these painful wilderness years actually forged their staggering global triumphs.
So, picture this. In 1996, a totally desperate, money-losing Apple ends up buying Next. Jobs walks right back through the very doors he was pushed out of. But he was no longer that 30-year-old kid. He was older, he was sharper. He took the brutal lessons from his wilderness years and used them to methodically launch the iMac, the iPod, and the iPhone. Let's be clear, this was not luck. It was absolute precision, born directly from failure.
At the exact same time, Schultz didn't just build a successful coffee shop. He took that tiny regional retailer and absolutely exploded it into tens of thousands of stores, creating a literal global cultural institution.
And what's amazing is Schultz literally used his childhood trauma as a blueprint. Remember his father's tragic story? Schultz took that profound wound and built his entire company's core values right on top of it. He provided comprehensive healthcare for part-time workers and offered stock options decades ahead of the rest of corporate America. He literally solved the exact vulnerability that had devastated his own family.
The results, for both of them, were just staggering. Apple became the most valuable company in the world, and Starbucks became a fixture on nearly every street corner on Earth. But we really have to remember that these monumental successes were built directly on the wreckage of their biggest defeats.
All right, let's wrap this up with Act 4, the lesson. We're going to synthesize everything we've learned in this explainer into one really powerful takeaway.
When you're in it, hitting rock bottom does not feel like some glamorous origin story or a neat launching pad. It feels like the absolute end. Jobs had no guarantee Next would actually save Apple. Schultz had no idea a painful rejection would eventually hand him the keys to the Starbucks empire. They simply kept working because stopping just wasn't an option they could live with.
Because the undeniable truth is this: failure isn't the opposite of success. It's the tuition you pay for it. The public humiliation, the intense financial fear, the long years of just grinding away in total obscurity, that was simply the heavy price of admission for the world-changing impact they would eventually have. So if you happen to find yourself wandering in your own wilderness right now, remember, the story isn't over. Which leaves us with this final question to ponder. Whether you're facing rejection, unemployment, or a total collapse of your identity, let this explainer serve as your reminder. You've paid the tuition. So, what will your second act look like? Keep building, and thanks for joining me today.